Hello, good afternoon. As usual, I will introduce week 7's lesson plans and assignments. Before I do that, I have a couple of announcements, and I will spend most of today's lecture talking about what was considered to be the first play in Italy on the topic of the automobile and society. If there is time, we can also talk about a collection of sonnets by the same author from Bologna, Alfredo Testoni, sonnets that were inspired by an international race that took place around the city of Bologna in the year 1908. As you see here from the first assignment on Thursday, and this is marked in the calendar as well, I have a meeting of the undergraduate program directors, so I will not go to my office right after the class as I do usually. Of course, if you want to see me this week or any other week, keep in mind that I'm on Zoom Monday, Wednesday, and Friday afternoons, and this link, which is also posted in the calendar, allows you to see what time slots are available on each of those days, 3 weeks ahead, and make an appointment and see me if you need any assistance. I found the time to process at least some of the pictures that I took at the Port Jefferson Hill Climb of September 24th, and I created a page that I put on SmackMag on my account, which you can access through a link. And the selection includes most of the older cars, and of course you can just click on any of these pictures and see them in detail. This is local collector from Roslin, Howard Kroplik, on his Alco Black Beast from 1909, which participated in the Vanderbilt Cup race of that year. And from Student Affairs, I received this message for dissemination about vaccination. You need to provide documents to prove that you're vaccinated in order to maintain your full-time status, your status as a student altogether at Stony Brook, and you can read all the details. This is week 7. We have Alfredo Testoni on the automobile, a play that was staged in 1904, published in 1907, and then published again in 1929. If there is time on Friday, I will add information about other examples of plays on the automobile during that decade in the US, in England, in France, in Italy, in Germany. There were a lot of comedies, a lot of plays that had the automobile as their focus, as a topic, and of course there were plenty of occasions in which people would place an actual automobile on the stage to impress the spectators. These are the sonnets that I mentioned before. They're devoted to a character created by this author, who's an old Bolognese woman who was born in the 19th century before the technological revolutions. Her name is Caterina, and she's ironically referred to as Lady Catherine, although she comes from the lower classes, and the author uses her to emphasize the experience of being introduced to the new technologies. For the automobile movies, this week we will be watching a series of short silent films, all very interesting. among the first and the most significant, showing the automobile and building up stories, plots around the automobile, starting with this pioneer of Western cinema, Georges Méliès, and his adventurous automobile trip, which was a global success, very successful not only in Europe, but in the US as well, as you saw from the image before. Parts of these films were colorized by hand, and it was widely distributed in American theaters. And then you'll find notes on each film about the themes and the style, and there are a few others. Question Mark Motorist is another famous film from the period. Most of these are a few minutes long only, because of course some of these were expensive and complicated to shoot, and towards the end you find some that are slightly longer, such as Barney Oldfield's Race for a Life, Barney Oldfield being an actual race driver and a very famous one from that period, who was forced to retire from his sports activities and for some time acted in Hollywood, same as with the Spit Kings, that is also slightly longer. All of these are available on YouTube, sometime on other platforms as well. Keep in mind, of course, that Monday and Tuesday of next week is the fall break, so there won't be classes or office hours on those 2 days. And when we see each other again after this class, well, on Thursday, and then Thursday of next week, on that day, I will be talking about the format, the methodology of the final project, providing examples, and of course, answering questions. By the way, the assignments for next week are just to review your notes and the presentation posted here, and excerpts from another romance motor novel that will be analyzed 2 weeks from now by Chicagoan actress Louise Prosser Hale, who was a theater and then later on a movie actress, and in 1906 published her best novel, The Successful Motor Car Divorce. And this is the first of 3 sets of passages from the book. This is the beginning, the first 4 chapters. So let's talk about Alfredo Testoni's play In Automobile, which could be translated simply On the Automobile. The way I would translate it to render the literary nature of the title would be Automobile Rides, or Going on Automobile Rides. Here you find a representation of the character based on their function within the play, and there are 2 or 3 characters. There are more than a dozen characters altogether in this play, and a few of them who are minor secondary characters are not mentioned in here. But clearly from this representation, you understand that the protagonist, the actor with the largest number of lines, is Emilio. And about 9 years ago, I believe, 9 or 10 years ago, I put together a group of students in an Italian class, ITL 313, and we produced and performed an abridged version of this play. I shortened the play, I reduced the number of characters just a little bit, and we performed at the end of the semester in the lecture hall 1 in the 1 center. So Emilio was the most difficult part right? The person who was on stage most of the time. Emilio is the character that all the stories lead to, the character most of the other characters interface with, and he has multiple functions. He represents the voice of reason. He's also sometimes there to render judgments, moral, ethical judgments on the actions of the other characters. And of course, there are moments in the play where he is the enabler, where he promotes the action of other characters. And the centrality of the character is associated in terms of themes with an interesting set of values, because this is a play about the dangers of the automobile, or rather the dangers of the automobile mania, of the obsession for the automobile. Yet at the center we find a character who lives in an apartment in downtown Florence, which is just above his office as a lawyer. Emilio works as an attorney. He actually works, is not rich enough to just have the title of lawyer or attorney but not practice his profession. He is a secularized professional. You will find in the first scene, in one of the exchanges from the first scene, that Emilio is being criticized by an Italian newspaper for doing business as a lawyer with all kinds of customers, including criminals, including women, as if the choice of the clientele of a lawyer should be anchored to a conventional set of values. Instead, Emilio is a modern professional who says this is what a lawyer does, which is not to render a moral judgment or to abide by a narrow set of traditional social values. So, working just in the floor below his apartment, where he lives with his young wife, Lina, Emilio is the less mobile of these characters and the most impervious to the obsession or the mania for the automobile. Is the only one who is not planning to get an automobile, doesn't want an automobile, has never been in an automobile until the end of the play, and during that ride he will get stranded together with the other people on the automobile and will have to return to his friend's home on foot in the evening or at night. So Emilio is not only a central character, but also the carrier of a message that is social and political, and in general is a message that is contrary to the automobile, because the automobile, as we will see from the events that develop around Emilio and within his circle of friends, is also represented on the stage in this play as a proxy for any kind of unreasonable desire or impulse or mania. And it extends in a safe way, in a way that is safe for the representation on stage, the judgment that is rendered in this comedy about sexual desire and sexual impulses, the sexual desires and impulses that may threaten the stability of a marriage in a bourgeois society, especially within a circle of friends who are supposed to be the upper echelon of Italian society, and therefore people who can easily get in a position of leadership. So at the beginning of the play, first act, we find Emilio in his office, which is an actual office with 2 employees, and he receives a visit from a local aristocrat, an old man by the name of Angelo Costanzi, who's also the head of the conservative and loyalist monarchical party in the city. Elections are to be held within a short period of time in Florence. Emilio himself is running for a position in the city council. However, Emilio is running under the banner of a radical party. And by radical, within the context of Italian politics from this period, I will offer more details a little later today, simply represents the progressive party. The party who wants a reform of Italian society. Angelo, of course, represents the conservative party, which is supportive of the monarchy. At the time, Italy was a monarchy. We're in 1904 when this was staged. And the traditional values of moderation. They have a conversation about speed, which is interesting because they're not talking strictly about the automobile. They're saying that speed is the new dimension of modern life, that everything has to be done quickly. And quickly means without the proper amount of reflection, without the appropriate use of reason. Angelo has come to visit Emilio exactly because, as I said before, he is aware that his own party spread a rumor and had an article published on a local newspaper badmouthing Emilio, saying that he is a lawyer of dubious morality exactly because he works with clients with a criminal record, or clients who are at the margin of society. Emilio says that he understands and that he still appreciates Angelo as a friend, and very much Emilio appreciative of Angelo's older sense of honor, right? Angelo, as an honorable political rival, adversary, would never had prompted the publication of this article to slander Emilio and limit his chances of victory during the election. Following the visit of Angelo, before Angelo, the Marquis, can leave Emilio's office, a lot of other characters come in, most of them women who are coming from upstairs, from the apartment where Emilio's wife, Lina, held a meeting of a committee that is doing or overseeing charitable work. So they're trying to launch a campaign, for example, to help the children of impoverished women during their infancy. And since most of these women are also members of the upper echelon, as you can imagine, they're Catholic members of the Catholic Church and devout Catholic followers. They are also planning to have a booklet of poems published to honor a local preacher, Father Gaudenzio. And they all come downstairs where they find Angelo and Emilio, and they insist that Emilio, who's also not just an intellectual, but also has some creativity, some literary creativity, they insist that Emilio help them fix the poems that they had written to honor this friar, poems that are too old-fashioned. Emilio resists their invitation, especially for several reasons. The first reason is that he is anti-clerical. He's not a believer. But the second and more compelling reason is that the elections are about to take place, and he's afraid that people in the local community will come to know that he was instrumental in the creation and the production of these poems, religious in nature, to honor a religious preacher, when in fact he is the candidate of the Radical Party. So he's afraid that his electors, that the people who were going to vote for him, would change their mind or think that he is a hypocrite. However, Lina, his young wife, who's very much in love with him and very, very affectionate, always displaying her affection for him, even in public, even in the presence of their friends, is so insistent that Emilio agrees to rewrite, revise, fix these poems. Of course, they all promise him that the news will not be spread, that no one in town will know that these religious poems were revised by Emilio himself. Among the people who come to Emilio's office during the first act, and Emilio's office turned into a living room, and in fact it is furnished almost like a living room, with a table, with chairs, with a sofa, not just with the desk. And on the desk, in the scene, we also find a telephone, right? Because technology is conspicuous in this play, and a button, an electrical button, a buzzer to call in the office staff. Among the people who come to visit and turn the office into an impromptu party are two men, Baron Ferrucci and Count Rossetti. Angelo is the oldest aristocrat in the play. Baron Ferrucci is a middle-aged baron, a middle-aged aristocrat. And the big difference between Angelo, who's an older guy, a conservative, someone closer to the traditional values, and Baron Ferrucci, is that Baron Ferrucci is more in line with the times and the times trends. And therefore, for example, he was taken violently by the mania, by the obsession for the automobile, and has purchased several of these automobiles. Ferrucci and Rossetti are there because the younger Count Rossetti, Ferrucci is married, he is married with Grazia. Rossetti is a young bachelor, and in fact he has a reputation of being a Don Juan, of being a womanizer. The young Count Rossetti, a few days earlier, has come to see Ferrucci asking for a favor. He needs to borrow one of his automobiles because Rossetti's automobile is being fixed. But then Ferrucci complains that after Rossetti borrowed one of his automobiles and returned it, he received tickets for speeding, various other kinds of violations, and he also is being sued by people who say that the car owned by him injured an expensive dog. Rossetti would like to help his friend, but is refusing to accept responsibility. Rossetti also claims that all that he is being accused of is false. Most importantly, the dog was a simple farm dog, according to him, and the dog simply chased after the car, and when he left, the dog still was in perfect health. So the dog was not hit by the car, and there could be an eyewitness because someone was with him, so there is someone who can confirm what he's saying, that the lawsuit doesn't have any ground. However, Rossetti refuses to have the passenger testify at a trial because Ferrucci doesn't want to pay, so in that case there would be a trial, and in order to defend himself he would need the precious testimonial of the eyewitness who was with Rossetti. Why is Rossetti refusing to bring into the trial this passenger or even to mention her name? Because it was a woman. So Ferrucci accuses Rossetti of being a womanizer, of borrowing the car, to have an illicit affair with a married woman, and they're all worried because, as Emilio suggests, if the other party who's suing Baron Ferrucci learns that Rossetti was with a woman and the woman cannot be named, cannot be even brought into the investigation, then they will ask for more money and obtain a larger amount of money. They would like Emilio to defend them. Emilio refuses to. Now, keep in mind what we said before. Emilio is a secularized professional, one who focuses on his job without letting conventional morality be a hindrance to the practice of law. However, Emilio is also here in the play to give a moral judgment over the actions of the characters. In this case, Emilio's refusal to enter into this situation represents a form of condemnation. Ferrucci is being morally condemned because of his terrible obsession with cars. Rossetti, of course, for breaking or attempted to break up a marriage, trying to engage in affairs with married women. So Emilio says, go see another lawyer by the name of Ristori. Of course, he will make you pay a lot of money, but that's good. That's the kind of punishment you deserve. You, Ferrucci, for being so obsessed with cars, and you, Rossetti, for being a marriage breaker. Emilio, after Ferrucci and Rossetti had left, Grazia approaches Emilio. Grazia is the wife of Emilio's best friend, Carlo. They're both lawyers, although it seems that Carlo is a wealthier, more successful lawyer, and Emilio is not as rich and powerful. From the conversation between Emilio and Grazia, we understand that the two had a relationship in the past. And Grazia, during this encounter, is very flirtatious with Emilio, however, respectful of Emilio's position. Emilio makes it clear that, yes, they had an affair in the past, but this was before Emilio was married. So Emilio shows, as the protagonist and as a model character, that a married man, although still able to attract other women and flirt with them, should refrain from having affairs that would threaten the stability of his marriage. And Grazia shows her own understanding of the situation. She simply says, we'll always be good friends, don't worry, I understand. Then another woman, a younger woman. Remember, Grazia is married to the middle-aged Ferrucci, so she's a bit younger, but still not very young. A younger woman, Renata, comes in. Renata is married with, did I say that Grazia was married with Carlo? Grazia is married with Ferrucci. So, sorry. Let's move on. Renata is married with Carlo. Renata comes to see Emilio. She's very nervous, very agitated, and it's important to note when you read the description, the captions, the directions for the characters, to note her agitation and the signs of her agitation. Renata is there because she has a problem, and first she says that this is a friend's problem. By the end of her scene, she will admit that in fact she is the married woman who was accompanying Rossetti when allegedly their car hit a dog, and now they're being sued for that. Renata is very worried. She's worried that if this goes to court, then a judge might force the people involved, the parties involved, to produce the eyewitness, and that her presence in the car as a married woman by herself alone, not supervised, with a man who's not married, she's afraid that this will ruin her reputation and also destroy her marriage with Carlo. And she herself asks for Emilio's help. And Emilio is a bit understanding, a bit more understanding compared to his reaction when Ferrucci and Rossetti came to see him, but still refuses to officially get engaged as the counselor, as the attorney in this trial, potentially, although he offers some help. Renata, during this scene, will explain how Rossetti was trying to get her to go with him, and showed that he was in love with her. And Renata says that during this period, her husband Carlo is not really paying much attention to her, and lacking her husband's attentions and affection altogether, suspecting possibly that Carlo is doing this because he is having an affair. Renata eventually accepted Rossetti's invitation and went for this ride. What she didn't realize is that when they got together, they were supposed to take an automobile. And the automobile is being portrayed in this play in a negative way, socially and ethically, because the increased mobility afforded by the car produces promiscuity. And Renata and Rossetti's ride is the perfect example, because Renata is being taken by Rossetti outside of the city of Florence. So, as long as, even if you're alone with a man who's not your husband and who's unmarried, but at least if you are within your local community, there are people there who see the both of you. And therefore, their indirect or direct censorious gaze will keep things in check, right? Will make it so that nothing may happen because you're in public, even though you are on a car. And this theme will be developed later on by others in a different direction. That is to say that even when you're in public on an automobile, privacy is guaranteed by the speed of the car. That is to say, if the car is speeding, then no one can see who is inside, as it would be possible with a carriage and horses who can travel normally between 5 and 12 miles per hour, and anyone can peek and see who's passing by. Renata and Rossetti go outside the city, so she's alone with this man, with no one there to protect her honor or to vouch for it. They go to a town in the countryside of Florence, and when they get there, the automobile brakes. And both Ferrucci, telling the episode, and Renata suspect that Rossetti is actually pretending that the car is broken so that they can spend the night together. They go to this inn to have dinner, but the inn has bedrooms upstairs. So clearly the plan by this young womanizer aristocrat, who's apparently also very successful with women, is to pretend that they need to have the car fixed before they can go back to the city and spend the night, and during the night she'll be not only alone, but away from her husband, away from anyone knowing her, and she may fall into this temptation of having sex with this younger man. Renata, during dinner, has a strong, violent physical reaction. She refuses to finish, insists on being taken back to Florence, and Rossetti will exactly do that. All of a sudden, the car is working again, and they drive back to Florence. Only this time, Rossetti is very angry at Renata for not getting what he wanted from her, and threatens her. He threatens to reveal their affair because he says that he still has one letter. They apparently were exchanging letters. These letters were very flirtatious, and this letter by Renata to him could be enough to ruin her honor and her reputation. And of course, it's an indirect blackmail, saying, well, I'll take you back home, but you'll have to go out with me again. Otherwise, I will not return this letter. So, in regards to this, Emilio offers his help. Emilio says, I'll help you recover the letter. I'll enable you from that point of view. Renata also spends time talking about the potential affair that Carlo may have, thinking that, after all, if she could, since her position within her marriage is threatened by the scandals, if at least she could gather the evidence that her husband is having an affair, such as knowing, identifying the mistress, then she could save her marriage, right? Because she could tell her husband, yes, it's true, I went out with Rossetti, we flirted in person and in writing, but you did worse. You had an actual affair, and I know who your lover is, so we can patch things up and have a new start for our marriage. With this, Emilio promises also to help her with this. However, while Emilio is trying to help Renata during the second and third act, the second and third act take place at Renata's house in the countryside outside of Florence, a few miles outside of Florence. Renata, during this party, we're in the month of May, so it's springtime in Tuscany, all the friends are together. Renata is watching very closely all the women because she thinks that whoever Carlo is having an affair with might be a woman belonging to the same circle. And in fact, it is true. This woman is Elena, who's a widow, and will appear during the second and the third act, will appear on an automobile driven by none other than Count Rossetti. So Renata starts suspecting that Lina might be Carlo's lover, simply because Lina, according to Emilia, spent 2 weeks away, and Lino thinks she went to Rome to see her mother, but Renata suspects that this is just a ruse, that she lied, that she said she was going to Rome for 2 weeks so that she could be free to meet with Carlo in an apartment in Florence. Carlo has a pied-à-terre in Florence where apparently he's taking his women, his mistresses. Emilio is a bit worried about this. Renata is quite convinced that Lina might be the culprit. And of course, by the end of the play, we discover that it is Elena. And you can see the morality ploy in this discovery, right? Because Elena is a very young widow, and as such is a woman who has a lot of independence because she is not being chaperoned like an unmarried daughter, a young woman who's not married yet, and she's not controlled by a husband. She's not under the authority of a husband. So in a very traditional view of society, such a woman has too much freedom, and she becomes threatening. In this case, she threatens the stability and the solidity of the marriage between Carlo and Renata. So what's the solution? Just look at this. You have a young man who's not married, who's threatening marriages. A young widow who's not married, who's threatening another marriage, and threatening the same marriage from both sides. So Rossetti is having a potential liaison with Renata, Elena is having an actual liaison with Carlo, and Elena is quite beautiful. Rossetti takes her to the party. How do you solve this? You force the two of them together. So Emilio and Carlo, and Emilio is the mastermind, approach Count Rossetti. And Rossetti gets afraid that Carlo has learned about his courtship of Renata and wants revenge. Carlo plays along. So it's the kind of good cop, bad cop routine where Emilio is conciliatory and saying this can be resolved. Carlo appears to be ironic but threatening, aggressive at the same time, and they tell him, so we saw you come to the party with Elena in the car. We know what you do with women in cars. You use cars to have sex with women, to have affairs with women, because cars have this powerful stimulating effect which is leading to an erotic arousal. And they say, well, if you're an honorable member of our circle and society, then at the end of this party tonight, you will go back to Florence with Elena. The two of you will be alone in the car. The moon will be up there. It'll be a romantic, perfect romantic context, the speed, the air, the moon, the stars, and you will declare yourself to Elena. And therefore, you will get married. This way, these two agents of immorality will be neutralized socially. At the end of the play, in the last two scenes, we find Renata and Carlo getting back together, having a small argument, a little argument, right? Because they both confess to what they have done. So it's clear that Renata is guilty of indiscretion. She hasn't kissed or had sex with Rossetti, but clearly it was not perfectly honest of her, according to the standards of society, to entertain such a close relationship with a young bachelor. Carlo is forced to admit that he has an apartment where he was meeting with Elena. They promise to be loyal, to be faithful to each other, and they appear to be very much in love at the end. Once you remove these threats, and Carlo is very happy to get rid of Elena, because Elena, as the lover, has become obsessed with Carlo. And this is where you see the parallel between the automobile and love and erotic impulses. They're both manias or obsessions. So Elena is obsessed with Carlo, and she's more demanding than a wife. And Carlo decides to stay with his wife because it's easier to handle the demands of a wife than the demands of a lover. And Renata would be perfectly happy with a little bit of affection and attentions. Emilio and Lina appear to be very much in love by the end of the play. Not that they had a problem before. The only problem was that Emilio, being a very well-balanced, mature kind of character, is being criticized in the first act by Lina because he's never displaying his affection. He's kind of cold, he's kind of distant. And by the end of the play, he will show that he is closer, will show more of his affection. But again, everything is more balanced compared to the characters who are obsessed with automobiles, with women, or with both. So clearly there is a moral agenda, and this will become clear once we talk about the historical context. So, as we said, this play was staged for the first time in 1904. 1904 is just 43 years after the unification of Italy, the partial unification of Italy. Up until 1861, Italy was fragmented politically, divided into about 10 to 12 different states, some of them quite small, smaller than Suffolk County, and some of them big enough, such as the Kingdom of Naples, to cover about 40% of the Italian territory. In 1861, through a series of wars and then political annexions, Italy becomes, 2/3 of Italy become unified under the Savoy, who were the leaders of Piedmont, of the Duchy of Piedmont, and that's the beginning of the Kingdom of Italy. In 1861, Rome, the place of the church, the Catholic Church, is not part yet of the kingdom, and in 1870, the Italian army attacks Rome, breaks through the walls near Porta Pia, conquer the city, and the Pope is confined into what is now Vatican City. So he's not a political leader of a large territory in central Italy anymore. Following this, though, Italian Catholics are encouraged by the church not to support the new state and the monarchy in charge of that state because of what they did to the Pope, because they took from the Pope what he controlled, whatever territory he controlled before, and made him a virtual prisoner within one of the smallest states on this planet. Keep in mind that between 1861 and 1870, from 1865 to 1871, Florence itself, where the play takes place, was the capital of Italy. So that gives you an idea of the centrality and the relevance of that town in Italian society. So Italy was a new nation, a young nation. In fact, a lot of Italian newspapers and American newspapers were talking about the connection between the US and Italy, both being considered younger nations, younger government on earth. One of the goals of this new government is to unify Italian society morally, to give it a mission, to educate the new nation to modern values. Italy during this period was, Italians were not highly educated. More than 90% of Italians could not read. Most of them could not speak the new standard Italian language that was sanctioned and introduced in the schools by this government. Therefore, the theater was seen as an agency that could be used to educate people. So most people spent very few years in school. Some of them did not go to school at all. A lot of people just went to school up to 3rd grade. The majority did not go past a middle school level education, but the majority of people attended the theaters, right? This is the period when opera was popular in Italy, but theater in general, including plays, tragedies, were very popular. So the new government said, let's promote products for the theater that can educate Italian society to the new values. So within this context, you have to place the play on the automobile. Within this political and broadly social agenda. And what are the values that theater and playwrights were supposed to disseminate? Of course, there were secular values, because a state that was born after they attacked the church and the Pope, of course, was based on the separation between church and state. So pragmatism was the view of life that was encouraged, and Emilio is certainly a pragmatist. Rationalism, seen as the opposite of any more primitive, more traditional religious belief or faith, including the belief in mystical texts or mystical individuals and miracles. Okay? And utilitarianism within the context of 19th century culture, which is not too far removed from this play, means you have to be productive. You have to be efficient in your life. And this applied to marriage means that you should stay away from a lover, not because the Bible says so, the commandments say so, but because it's a waste of time and energy. And Carlo himself, although very much in love with Elena, discovers this kind of truth, that it's better for him to stay with Renata because Renata is low maintenance. They're married. She would be happy to stay with him, where Elena is too demanding and she wants to control him. So you will find a lot of indirect references when you read the play about stability, about order, about peace. And of course, who's going to ensure this? The governmental agency, the social agencies, right? And you'll find a lot of situations where you have teachable moments, right? What is a good lawyer? What is a bad lawyer? What happens when you surrender reason, when you give up on being reasonable and become obsessed with an automobile? Again, as a proxy for being obsessed for a woman, you pay for it, right? And you always have to worry about honor in terms of time and energy. Honor and reputation require a long investment, a lot of time and energy to build up your reputation, can be destroyed in a moment, and it takes a lot of time to rebuild them. And a lot of books, both in Italy, Western Europe, and in the US, within what we can call now the Atlantic culture, a lot of books about social hygiene, about this idea that society and the mechanisms of society, the practices, the norms of society should be regulated by quasi-scientific laws. And what is that makes a marriage, a healthy marriage? It's a balance in the law of supply and demand. The woman demands attention and affection. The husband is supposed to supply those. The woman should not be too demanding. The man should not be too distant or too cold. Okay? And of course, a healthy marriage becomes the foundation of a healthy society. And you find that in a number of plays. For example, there is an incredible, almost grotesque play during the same period, the early 1900s in Italy, by another author, that is based on this far-fetched plot. The protagonist is a stockbroker who, because of his job, is under a lot of pressure because at the beginning of the play, is losing money. And he's working and working and working, trying to recover from this crash. His wife, who's a young woman, is too affectionate in a sexual way. And this ruins the poor husband's health. In a dramatic scene towards the end of this play, a doctor who plays the part of a social instructor of sorts, a doctor tells her, "You will kill your husband if you don't refrain from asking for so much sex, because you see your husband is stressed." Stress was called neurasthenia during this period, was considered to be the, the disease of the time. The idea was that high-paying jobs were the most stressful jobs. The doctor tells her what their healthy relationship should be with less sex. She cannot control herself. And of course, by the end of the play, the husband is admitted into a mental hospital, right? And that will teach her. Okay. Of course, there are many references to what is prosperity, what is growth in society. Well, in the name of growth, you cannot just, as a lawyer, as a good lawyer, entertain business relationships with honest individuals. You have to defend prostitutes, you have to defend criminals. That's what a lawyer is about. Forget what the Church or the Bible say. Of course, democracy and equality in this play, in this society, are limited to the elites. And you will see a scene with office clerks in Emilio's office arguing with each other to show that the populace is trying to participate in the elections, but they don't understand what the elections are about, what politics is about. They need leadership. They need guidance, right? So this is altogether a kind of society where everything happens from the top. There is a sense of meritocracy. You have success based on your merits as an individual, including your reputation, right? And harmony within the marriage, harmony within society are seen as strong values because of the political context. Again, Italy is just coming together as a country, and this process of social unification will last 100 years. It will take until the 1960s for Italy, for Italians to develop a national identity. And then, a few years later, you have the beginning of the European Union. Actually, it had begun in the post-war period, but it solidified the idea of the European Union in the 1990s. And there you understand why, to this day, Italians have a weaker national identity than other Europeans altogether. And they're still connected to their local community more than to the nation. Strangely enough, there are no children in these families, in these couples, okay? And we talked about efficiency and energy. So we talked also about the consequences of an affair. So instead of saying, don't have an affair because you'll go to hell, they're educating the public about not having an affair because your personal freedom will be limited by the demands of your mistress. You'll spend a lot of time and energy, more than you want to, on your lover. And you'll be always nervous because of the fear or threat of a scandal. And by the way, Emilio will resolve Renata's situation. He will teach her a trick by which she can recover the letter that is still in the hands of Count Rossetti. She will destroy the letter, and Count Rossetti will be humiliated, will end up with a piece of paper in his hand that forces him to donate 500 liras to the charitable committee, 500 liras being 10% of the value of a car for the period, right? It's funny that they're talking basically about supply and demand, right? So the laws of economy, the laws of capitalism end up being applied to a marriage. And you find representation in this play of the various classes. I can skip some of these and you can read them yourself. Keep in mind this idea, mobility equals promiscuity for women who are moving around unsupervised, without their husband, without a relative. And this applies not just to the automobile, but even to the train. So the fact that Lina, Emilio's wife, goes to Rome exposes her to the suspicion that since she was alone, maybe she stopped at another place and saw Carlo and had an affair with Carlo. And to, again, reinforce this idea that mobility equals promiscuity. I can tell you briefly about Roberto Bracco's short story, Roberto Bracco being a southern Italian writer who was nominated for the Nobel Prize during this period, although he didn't get it, was nominated more than once. And he has this incredible, again, big grotesque kind of short story where a man and a woman are in the train, in the same compartment. They're spending time together. He is observing her. She's a beautiful woman, well-dressed, a representative of the upper classes, clearly. And he's obsessing about her to the point where before the end of the story, they have a conversation and he reveals that is so attractive to her, and they agree for a transaction. He will give this woman an incredible amount of money, something like 2,000 liras, that would be tens of thousands of dollars today, to have sex on the train before she gets off. And she does. And he's surprised, of course, very surprised, when he sees that she gets off the train where her husband, her son are there to wait for her. And he sees confirmation, he sees evidence in front of his eyes that she's not in fact a courtesan, a high-level prostitute, but she's a member of the aristocracy. Okay? But again, this is just to show more evidence of this common theme for the period. More mobility, increased mobility will bring increased promiscuity. That's the idea. A faithful woman, an obedient woman, is one who doesn't leave the house so much, right? Or by herself, for sure. And I'll skip things that you can read by yourself. Keep in mind this last section, the links are just for you to explore, but when you see Renata being very nervous, when you find Renata's description of her reaction to the automobile, the psychological effects and the physical effects that the automobile ride had on her, keep in mind the medical ideas, the biological ideas from the period. For example, found in this famous criminologist and anthropologist, Cesare Lombroso, in the female offender. He studied female biology, and he studied the medical phenomenon that was very prominent during this period called hysteria, right? So the idea was that a lot of women suffer from this form of pathology that makes them excessively impressionable, move to sudden and reasonable likes and dislikes, or prey to their impulses. They are prone to undergo hypnotic suggestions, etc., etc. So these are all quotes from Lombroso to describe female biology that lets you understand the representation of the agitation of Renata, where the idea is the automobile is especially dangerous because many women can be very impressionable and very reactive to these kinds of situations. And I added a few words about passion, but and desire, but that's fine, I believe, yes. So I'll just stop for a couple of minutes for questions and comments, and then I will introduce the sonnets briefly. In the meantime, I will also circulate the attendance. So questions, comments, reactions, especially if you've read the play yourself and you're curious to know about details, episodes that I have not mentioned or analyzed. Keep in mind, if you haven't read the readings yet, that you will also find, I'll just show you highlights. So I highlighted in color. If you're reading from your computer, or from the phone, from a tablet, I've highlighted passages that are more significant. Now that you've heard my introduction and the reference to the main themes, you can easily connect these passages to some of those ideas. Questions, comments? Yes,
so,
please.
Did they mention any like specific models?
Of cars?
Yeah.
No, they don't. And we know that the author, Testoni, owned cars. He was himself an enthusiast, a car enthusiast, even though the car is criticized, right? Or rather, the mania for the car is criticized in this play. He was already an established playwright, Testoni, by the time he put on stage this play. He went on to have another 20 years of success on the stages of Italy and died in the late 1920s. He also wrote some poetry and a couple of novels, short stories, but it was theater that gave him the most success. So you have to imagine that this play would be on a stage in a variety of Italian cities, touring through Italy and being performed for a week, 2 weeks, for a month in some places, with people filling up the theater every night. People not just from the same kind of bourgeois classes or aristocracy represented in the play, but even people from the lower classes, and they were there to have fun, right? So this was supposed to be a form of fun. At the same time, the fun was the lure, the bait, to provide a teaching and moral lesson that was approved by the government. And the government helped playwrights who were writing plays based on a social agenda that was compatible with the agenda of the government by giving them prizes and other forms of financial support. So the government was, during this period, actually spending money on theater, promoting a certain kind of theater with an ideology that they saw favorably. More questions, comments? Okay, so let me just show you a couple of things about the sonnets, and we'll talk more about them on Friday. So these sonnets were first published in October 1908 on a journal, and the illustrations you find at the top of this page and throughout the page are from the publication on the journal. They were inspired by a race that happened the month before. So the race took place on September 6th and 7th in 1908. The month after that, Testoni published the sonnets. And the year after that, they were republished in a collection inside a book. And they are written in the dialect of Bologna rather than the standard Italian language. This is the racetrack. Okay. So in 1908, the race that took place was called Targa Florio. They had one race on Sunday for actual race drivers, professional race drivers, sportsmen. And the next day, on Monday, they had a second race for gentleman driver driving stock cars, or cars that were as close to stock as possible. The city of Bologna is more or less here. Borgo Panigale is where now the airport of Bologna is. And as you can see, the track was very simple. Even the Vanderbilt Cup racetrack was similar. That is to say, tracks from this period whenever cars had to lap around the same track several times, were mostly a series of straights with a few turns in between. So the straights were as long as 5 to 8 miles. So you have a very long straight going out of Bologna, then a short series of turns, another short straight, then a 90-degree turn, another straight, another brief series of turns, and then down to Bologna once again. The record for the the record speed for the race was around 130 kilometers, so that would be approximately 85 miles. Okay, to give you an idea, but it was a very high speed for this period. And of course, a lot of people came to see the race. A lot of postcards were made to commemorate the events. Postcards were very popular during this period. This is just one of many that you can find online, and sometimes you find them for sale as well. See the postage and the stamp of the post office in here, and you see here a similar representation of the racetrack. They just made it perfectly horizontal, when in fact it's not going perfectly westwards, but west and north. And you have the places we're going by, and you have the participants, and you have the crowds around the track. And I'll just read the first of these poems. The protagonist is this old woman who's a widow and who has a relatively young daughter, someone who's in her 20s or low 20s, Gaetana. So Caterina is the only one who is supposed to control her daughter, give her an education, defend her honor. And Lady Catherine is an older woman with an older kind of lifestyle. Gaetana, her daughter, is trying to leave the current trends and looking for what is fashionable, including the automobile. The idea is once again that Gaetana's pursuit of men who own an automobile is leading to promiscuity, therefore the automobile itself is dangerous. Caterina, as I said before, is kind of poor, comes from the lower classes. She cleans houses for a living, and her daughter is trying to marry up in society. Clearly, during this period, whoever owns an automobile or even has a driver must be quite rich. So, Lady Catherine herself, however, is aware of the fact that the car is a status symbol. In this first sonnet, sonnets are written in the dialect of Bologna. The voice is the voice of Lady Catherine, the older woman. She describes how her daughter has a relationship of sorts, an affair, liaison, with a marquis who has a car. And this is what Lady Catherine says in Sonnet 1. For some time, we, my daughter and I, have been socializing with the marquis. So, through her daughter's beauty, she herself, Lady Catherine, is able to move up in society, at least in terms of appearances. He's always taking us around, because for the sake of appearances, the mother has to be there. The daughter otherwise wouldn't be allowed to go with a man if they're not married or at least engaged. And without spending a dime, I have, one could say, an automobile at my disposal, right? So I'm an automobile, everyone thinks I'm rich. And now, my daughter's only preoccupation is that I too learn those expressions that are necessary for those who hear me talk to mistake me for a true woman of the sport. Remember that going on an automobile ride was classified as a sport, an activity that required physical exercise. And the fashion, the trendiness of the car is connected to the language, right? If you are seen on a car, that's not enough. You need to speak the language of the automobile to show that you are a practitioner of the sport, and then you'll be really fashionable and cool. And she, my daughter, is giving me lessons the whole day, but I get confused between the 30s and the 40s. 30s and 40s were categories of cars, 30 HP, 40 HP, not just in Italy, but elsewhere in the US as well. Between power, horses, and what have you. So much that people, I bet, are laughing behind my back, and for sure they label me an ignoramus as powerful myself and the 100 horses, where the final pan in the sonnet is the double meaning between the power of a car and the ignorance of a person, because there was a saying in the language of Italy during the 19th century that as big as the strength of a horse, that could be the dimension of someone's stupidity or ignorance. Okay? So you have an idea and you have a context for the sonnets as well. Okay? So you have another assignment, written assignment, will be practically the last one. Will be another very small, very simple assignment later on, but basically tomorrow's assignment should be the last substantial one. If you need any help, come see me after the class or schedule a Zoom meeting with me tomorrow afternoon. Okay? Otherwise, I'll see you on Thursday. Thank you for coming. Bye.